You. Good morning, everybody. Professor Manuel Leitor, Professor George Griffin, distinguished speakers, dear colleagues, dear students, it's a pleasure to have you here today attending this conference on medical education. Professor Manuel Leitor is the Minister of Science, Technology and Higher Education in Portugal. We are very pleased and grateful to you for accepting to be here with us today in this opening of this conference, and also for your support in integrating this conference into the Portuguese Presidency. Professor George Griffin is the president of FEAM. Thank you very much for the opportunity to organize this conference. That was intended to be held in Lisbon. I hope that you can all meet again in person and soon. Professor George Griffin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Maria. It's a great privilege to be invited to Portugal. A shame we cannot meet in person, but at least we have the second opportunity now with Zoom. FEAM is the Federation of European Academies of Medicine. We have 23 academies from within Europe. Some new ones in veterinary medicine and in pharmacy, and we extend from Israel and Romania in the east through to the UK in the west. So we have a very comprehensive network, and it's my great pleasure to be president of this organization and help its growth and development. I'm a practicing physician, and I am very, very keen on medical student and postgraduate education. After all, it's in all of our interests to have good doctors to look after us. So we thought that this was a great idea. It was Maria's idea to have medical education as this topic. And we have a very distinguished group of physicians, pathologists, and surgeons who will lead us through the ideas of where we should be going, followed by discussion. So I will hand back to Maria now and look forward to a really, really interesting conference. Maria.
Thank you. Professor Manuel Leitor, if you please.
Good morning to everyone, and welcome also to the Portuguese Presidency of the European Union. We have welcomed with a great pleasure this idea to organize a conference on medical education. Actually, throughout this semester, a number of related conferences are being organized. Last week, the European Students' Union organized its 41st convention around Europe, and again, a number of actions related with the so-called European Universities Alliances will be organized in the coming months. And these are particularly timely because you know very well we live unprecedented times in Europe and throughout the world. Certainly we are facing a large uncertainty in all our lives, not only in the health sector, but in many social and economic activities. But there are also some certainties, and we know for sure that education and higher education is certainly our common goal. And about medical education and about the context of the evolution of the health system, we also have a wide variety of opinions, a large uncertainty, but we know that science-based education and the close triangulation between healthcare, scientific developments, and graduate education are certainly the way to move forward. We should remember that Europe at large in 2020 has achieved the average target of 40% of all of those aged 30 to 34 years old have completed an higher education degree. And certainly this was a path throughout Europe with a quite large diversity in different European zones, but it is not enough. The target for Europe by 2030 is to have 50%, say half of the population between 30 and 34 years old with an higher education degree. And this again covers a wide range of fields of knowledge, of specializations, but for sure, medical education per se, and more the related areas, either in association with digital transition, but also with so-called green and ecological transition, become a reality more and more. That is the reason why the Portuguese presidency has focused its priority on 5 areas, particularly in Europe that we want to be digital, to be green, but also to be resilient. And for these 3 pillars to be achieved, we need to have a social dimension and a global dimension. Actually, about the health system in particular, the resilience of Europe has become very acute. We know during the pandemic that, for example, pharma industry in Europe depends more than 80% from materials imported, particularly from Asia and particularly from India. And this external dependence puts an increasing pressure in Europe to build a resilient paradigm. And that will be the context of the so-called Next Generation Europe program and the related recovery plans, which have been designed throughout the entire Europe. And we hope that by next summer, all countries will have its own recovery plan. Certainly, medical education has a place to do, and as you know, in most European countries, if not all European countries, their recovery plans do consider and do cover the health system and medical education in particular. And to conclude, I will say that particularly in higher education at large, but certainly also in medical education, we certainly need to understand the diversified European context of higher education, but there are in general 4 main challenges. First, the enlargement of those roles, and again, the capacity to enlarge, but also the attraction of medical education varies a lot across Europe, but certainly the average figures, so definitely a need to enlarge the enrollment of youngsters in medical education. Second, we can only consider enlargement together with diversification and specialization. Again, different countries have different approaches towards the diversification, particularly in early stages and initial education, for example, with general medicine and specialized medicine. And we know that the diversification of the medical education is a concern, certainly can only be done in close interaction with the professional and the hospital community, but also be done together with specialization. And specialization, particularly in terms of postgraduate education, can only be done in a close context of research and innovation. The third challenge throughout Europe will be more and more employability of higher education graduates. And again, this is a question throughout the entire Europe in different areas of knowledge and also in medical education. And again, more and more, the orientation for the close triangulation between education, research, and innovation, where, for example, clinical academic centers play an increasing role in postgrads employment and innovative employability, particularly in connection with the digital transition and the context of data science, particularly applied to the medical profession. Last but not least, our fourth challenge in Europe is becoming more and more internationalization. As you know, we will launch next month the new framework for Erasmus, either in terms of an increasing context for mobility of students, and that certainly needs to be considered also in terms of medical education, but also strengthening the context of the European university alliances. That was a process started about 2 years ago. Now Europe at large has about 41 European universities, and the context for enlargement that in close interaction with research and innovation, in particular in the framework of Horizon Europe, will be a context which will certainly affect all areas of higher education and in particular medical education. So again, I thank you for this conference, for certainly the invitation, and to give place to medical education in particular and to higher education, certainly building up the future generation of medical doctors throughout Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Manuel Leitor. Well, the first speaker will be Professor Fausto Pinto, but before introducing Professor Fausto Pinto, I want to introduce Catherine Collins. She's a science communication professional, and she will help us today in this conference. If you want to put some questions, please use the chat during the presentations, and Catherine will receive the questions from the audience during the presentation. Well, Professor Fausto Pinto is a professor of cardiology. He is the Dean of the Faculty of Medicine of the University of Lisbon. So he is my Dean. He's the head of Cardiology and Heart and Vascular Department at the University Hospital Santa Maria, and president of the Cardiovascular Center of the University of Lisbon. He was president of the Council of Deans of the Portuguese Medical Schools. At the moment, he is president of the World Heart Federation. Professor Fausto Pinto, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Maria do Céu and Professor Griffin, dear Minister and dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. I feel very privileged to give this first conference, and I certainly thank Maria do Céu and George for this very kind invitation. So my challenge for the next few minutes is to speak a little bit about what is the phasing change of medicine in the next 10 years, which, as you can imagine, is not an easy task. Looking into the future, particularly in the current times, it's probably one of the most risky things to do, since the world is moving so fast, and the level of, on one hand, uncertainty, but at the same time, fast pace is so amazing that, of course, is always a challenge. But at the same time, you always feel very humble when you have to look into the future, and particularly when you've done this over the years and you look back and see what really happened over the years. So what I will try to do now, this is my hospital here in Lisbon. We would have loved to have hosted you here, and he would have been here. This is the main building of the hospital, where the medical school is also included. And these two buildings in the back, they belong to the medical school, and they are used for many different activities, from labs, scientific labs, research labs, auditoriums, and so on. And many of our research facilities from the medical school, they are in these two buildings, although some of them are also in the main hospital building. And together we form what is called the Academic Medical Center of Lisbon, that the minister had a chance to also touch upon a little bit. Well, we are living in a world, and that's clear for everybody, where we are facing different challenges. And it's the way that we will be able to face those challenges that will impact on the way that we will be forming and educating the future medical doctors or the future health professionals. I will be addressing more to medical doctors because medical schools, they are the main focus is to educate medical doctors, although of course there are other professional exits for students in medical schools. But I would say that the main purpose of medical schools, and that's something which is actually an interesting discussion. There are different models, as we know. Europe, we have a model even with some differences among countries. In the US, they have a totally different model with the concept of the colleges, and then only going afterwards for, let's say, the special area of interest. But it's important to understand what is the current situation and how much that can affect the way that will impact on the way that we will be organizing our teaching. Well, if you look at the OECD countries, and these are just some recent statistics, we know, and if you look at what is the impact of the different diseases and the different medical problems, we know that more than half of these medical problems that evolve into mortality or morbidity, they are due to the so-called NCDs, non-communicable diseases, where cardiovascular diseases and cancer, they play the central role in this setting. And this is important to understand, so we know exactly what we are dealing with. Of course, I'm a cardiologist, so sorry for being a little bit biased, but cardiovascular disease is still the #1 killer, although being challenged at the moment by COVID, by the way. But COVID will disappear, at least will disappear with the impact it has now. And unfortunately, cardiovascular disease as well as cancer will continue. But the main issue, and this is something that has to be educated, is important for the education of the future doctors, which have an impact on the population, is that 80% of premature death from cardiovascular disease could be avoided. And this is something that a lot of people don't realize. We're talking about around 18 million deaths per year. And what is more shocking, and again should impact on the way that we should educate our students, is that, and this is from Eurostat a couple of years ago, 1 out of 3 deaths in the EU could have been avoided in the light of current medical knowledge and technology. So what we know today, what is on the guidelines, if it was done across the board and fully done, we could avoid 1/3 of the deaths, and the large majority of those still in the cardiovascular field and also in the oncology field. And we are living in a society that is aging, and aging is a real issue. On one hand, it's good because we have more populations living longer, but we want to have healthy populations, and that we want to have prolonged healthy life. And that's also a concept which is not only the duration of life that we have, but what is the percentage and the amount of healthy life that we can add to our population, knowing that the age pyramid, and this is for Europe, this is in 2004, and this panettone will be the prediction for 2050 with a different shape of the curve, which certainly will have a major impact also on the way that we practice medicine. We also live in a world now where the different life aspects and the different ways of living have an impact on the way that we live. And for instance, if we look at the prevalence of obesity, which is another pandemic that we are living now, and overweight, you can see here, and this is again recent data that shows that in some countries, close to 70% of the population is either obese or overweighted. And of course, this has a major impact on the prevalence of certain diseases like diabetes or cardiometabolic syndrome and many other conditions. Unfortunately, our country is not so well positioned in diabetes. And the same for some other important risk factors with a major impact in the populations like smoking, which is still a problem, and particularly now with the e-cigarettes and with the vapings and all these innovations that the tobacco industry has been very creative, but with still major impact in the populations across the world, with some areas more affected than others. But we still have a problem in Europe. We still have a gender gap in the smoking rates. And this, of course, has implications in the way that healthy lifestyles will evolve. Well, if we look at some interesting data coming from some parts of the world, we can see, for instance, how tackling risk factors and how tackling some of these elements that I just showed had an impact, positive or negative impact in the populations. And here we can see, for instance, the Swedish example, where they tackled in a very aggressive way risk factors like cholesterol, smoking, control of blood pressure, physical activity, and the impact on the risk factors was much better. It was much higher than the impact by treating. So again, like Hippocrates already said, it's better prevent than treat. But we can see also the opposite. And this is the example of China, where the worsening of these risk factors, in part due to westernized diet and many other factors, it went the other way with a substantial increase in the death rate, mortality, and morbidity due not only to cardiovascular disease but NCDs as a whole. And what is even more striking is if we look at what makes us healthy, about 50% is related with our healthy behaviors. 20% is about the environment, and there's a big focus now on air pollution or quality of the air and many other factors. 20% genetics, and about 10% access to care only. But if we look at what we as a society spend on being healthy, we see that close to 90% is spent on treating, on medical services. So it's quite a disparity. Only about 4% is spent on healthy behaviors. So this is something that certainly will impact the future and should be looked at. It's being looked at, of course, this is known for some time, but this is something that the community as a whole has to address in a very positive way. And actually, if we look at the recommendations from WHO, the governments have committed to a global vision for NCDs with this goal of reducing premature non-communicable disease mortality by 1/3 by 2030. And again, it's a challenge. It's a big one, but of course, you need measures and you need to address these in a very objective way. And this is something which is affecting the whole world and certainly will affect also the way that we will educate our students. But then it came the coronavirus, the SARS-CoV-2. And then, and I will just, of course, I'm not going to talk a lot about COVID, although now it's the main problem that we are facing globally as a society. But there was one interesting aspect I wanted to bring up here. There is already an impact on life expectation. This just came out just a few days ago. And if you look at life expectation projections for 2020 by race and ethnicity in the absence of COVID, and then under what we are currently facing, there is already evidence that there will be an impact on life expectancy. And actually, this will have an impact in many ways in our society, as you can see here as a whole. And you can see that it's different across the different ethnicities. And this, of course, this will bring us to another discussion. But you can see here that if you look at life expectancy currently at birth, it's about 1.2 years difference already reducing in life expectancy. And it's about 1 year if you look at life expectancy at age 65. Certainly to take into account, and certainly something also that should drive policies into the future. Well, but we are living in a world where there have been a lot of innovative breakthroughs, and it's fundamental then when we are organizing and looking at medical education, and medical education is medical and education, that all these, and of course I could have put here some more, had a major impact on the way that not only we practice medicine, and keep in mind that to practice medicine and to practice medicine with high quality, you need to have high quality medical education performed by medical educators, which at the end will be all of us who practice medicine. That's the Hippocratical principle of medical education, sometimes forgotten. And these innovative breakthroughs, they certainly had an impact in the way that, again, not only the practice of medicine, but also the teaching of medicine and medical education, from molecular biology, stem cell research, bionics, organogenesis, synthetic biology, artificial intelligence, health sensors, sensing technology. We could add here a lot of other ones, but certainly these would correspond with what we can call disruptive innovations. And we have here a set of 12 disruptive technologies which had an impact on the way that it's not only for medicine, of course, but on the way they impacted the medicine. And this goes from artificial intelligence to automation of knowledge work advanced robotics, next generation genomics, virtual augmented reality, 3D printing, and many others who have, and particularly these ones, a major impact on the way that, and they're changing, and they are modeling the way that the medicine is being developed, is being organized. Just a few examples, I will not get into details. The introduction of CRISPR, for instance, gene editing, which is already with results. This is something which is already having an impact, particularly in some niche of diseases. 3D printed biological materials. In my field, this has been quite interesting and quite relevant. An example here of 3D printing, reconstructing the geometry of the tricuspid, the annulus in the tricuspid valve, which is now a tool being used for planning, not only for diagnostic purposes, but even for surgical planning or for interventional planning. Wearable technology, this is already common use in many instances, and the Google Glasses is just one of the examples. Microchips modeling clinical trials. This is has been developed over the last few years, and as you know, the whole concept of clinical investigation and the organization of clinical trials has been changing quite a lot. We are not doing the same type of clinical trials because they're becoming impossible almost to organize the classical clinical trials with 20,000, 25,000 patients. They still exist, of course, but more and more the need to have different approaches to clinical trials, and the concept of the microchips is certainly a very interesting one. And keep in mind that we live in the era of we can call the quantified self. There's an explosion of wearables, of apps, digital health devices, basically riding the exponential wave of smaller and cheaper mobile connected and applied sensors and computing. These are all over the place now, and these certainly have to be included. They're shaping the way medicine is being practiced and is being organized, but also the way medicine should be taught. And this has to be included in our curriculum, should be influencing the way we organize our medical education. Digital medicine is here. It's been one of the huge advances, and it's been, again, a very good marriage between technology and medicine. And this is something which we've seen over the years, the ability to have the what we can call translational, if you will, of the development of technology with medicine, the importance of multidisciplinary approach, and the importance of including science, technology into medical developments. This has been certainly the last few years have been fantastic in the way this has been done. And we can consider what could be a smart medical home, where you have all the different types of elements that can collect information on the people living in that house, biological biomarkers, biological parameters, different types of information that then can help and can improve the way, not only from a medical perspective, but even just from a living perspective, can improve the way people can live, can adapt more to the individual, what we can call not only precision medicine, because that's facing more the sick person, but the precision living. So could help each one of us maybe to adapt better according with our characteristics to a better living, a better way to develop our societies. Of course, this has been also having a major impact in the use of these technologies on remote access to remote transmission. This is just one example, a study that was done using telecardiology with these kiosks, where you could do self-imaging using ultrasound, imaging of the heart, and you could transmit. This was a study done between US and Germany, and again, developing this concept of remote monitoring. Again, here, what we can call the digital nutritionist. You have all the information about the person in terms of the genome, the microbiome, the sleeping patterns, activity level, the metabolic profile of that person, and then match that with the type of food, for instance, and we know how important this is now. It's a science now, how much this can be done and can help the society, the individual person, to have a better diet according with her own or his own constituency. Now, just a short word on artificial intelligence. This is, it's a buzzword, but it's a buzzword that has a lot of implications in different aspects. And in medicine, it's having a huge implication now, and certainly one area that needs to be more and more used by the medical community. By the way, we started in our medical school a Center for Artificial Intelligence. We are privileged to have an engineering school in our university. So we are working together with our engineering colleagues to develop artificial intelligence in the field of medicine, because again, it's fundamental that if you want to develop this area, that the medical community is involved from the beginning, not feeling afraid, because at the beginning there were some concerns, there are still some concerns, but fundamental that they're involved, we are involved as a medical community in this area, because that's going to be the way to make it not only available, but really useful for the use of medicine. So it's basically, we all know it's a branch of computer science, just for specific clinical tests in which AI systems are being currently utilized, generating alerts and reminders, diagnostic assistance, therapy, critical and planning, image recognition and interpretation. And by 2025, AI systems are expected to be implemented in 90% of the US and 60% of the global hospitals and insurance companies. So this has to be done has to be taught, has to be included in the medical curriculum. It has to influence the way that we do medical education. And this is the other concept that I would like also to bring up here, which is something that it's also very relevant for the education of future medical doctors. And with all these developments, we are seeing what we can say is a shift between what was in the past a more paternalized medicine, which is over basically, with more empowerment to the doctor, and more what this means is increasing the empowerment of the patient. So it's not only just a buzzword to say that medicine should be patient-centered. I do believe in patient-centered medicine, but it's even more than that. It's the patient to be more, and we know how much today the populations have access to all this information. And of course, that's good, but at the same time, it's important that this link between the patient and the doctor has to be done in an informed way, and has to be done in the way that there is more and more empowerment of the patient, so the patient is more and more involved in the treatment strategies if he's sick, or in the development of strategies to be healthier. So promoting of health, treating disease, empowerment of the population, if you will, and particularly when the people are sick, the empowerment of the patient, being engaged and its own treatment. And this is something, again, that has to be taught, that has to be included, embedded into the minds of the future generations. Of course, when we are talking about these issues, and particularly now with the pandemic, there was a huge expansion of telemedicine, or if you want to be even broader, we can go into the concept of telehealth. So telemedicine basically, it's a creative healthcare delivered at a distance. If you want a simple definition, telehealth is much broader, with preventive, promotive, and curative healthcare delivered at a distance, and then e-health, or m-health, which is also mentioned today, which again aggregates all these different elements. There are numerous types of telemedicine. I will not get into all the details, but again, this is a reality, and it has to be, again, embedded in medical education. So it has to be done in a way that can be useful, and it can be done in a safe way for our future medical doctors. Just to give an example, with the pandemics, there was a boost in the use of telemedicine. Before the pandemics, and this is data coming from the US, about more than 50% never have used telemedicine. And now we have data already, this is coming from Massachusetts, and it showed, it was comparing the use of telehealth during this pandemic, before and after. Overall, there was a threefold almost increase in the use of telemedicine or telehealth. And you can see that it was a little bit across the board, but particularly for the older population. for many reasons, of course, but this is positive. It's good because there's an adherence of the older population also to these new technologies. Of course, telemedicine has a business involved, which is not bad at all, because to have business involved also means there is investment, and this has been one area where there's currently a huge investment, which was even more boosted by this pandemic. Again, it can facilitate a broad range of interactions using different devices, different modalities with the patient location in different areas. These are just some examples of how it was used during this pandemic. But the concept here is telemedicine is here to stay regardless. I know there's a big discussion on many aspects related with telemedicine, but again, this is like science. Science is unstoppable, and we've seen when people try to stop it, what happens. It's just, we have to deal with that, and we have to be able to cope with that, and certainly understand and use it for the benefits of our populations. This is just an example of how the American Surgical College developed just recently an outpatient telemedicine program during this COVID pandemic, and how much this has really been useful for the management of patients. And talking about digital healthcare, we believe, and this is coming from WHF now, that digital healthcare can contribute very seriously to what is, as you know, is I would say the main goal of WHO, and particularly the General Director, which is a universal health coverage, and certainly digital healthcare. And these are just some of the interactions of several factors that made this technology leap forward in healthcare. This will certainly have a major impact also on the way healthcare is going to be done in the future. These are 5 recommendations on the use of digital health, digital technology, building digital capacity of the health workforce, increasing the literacy of patients, their families, and communities, to be protecting end users by establishing regulations and protocols for patient privacy and safety, ensuring sustainable financing mechanisms for digital health through establishing infrastructure and prioritizing funding for this specific area, and supporting research on digital health, setting priorities that address digital health inequities. I do believe this is one very relevant area for the next few years. But always, and this is where we really have to be very, very clear, always based on ethical principles, that values don't change, or they shouldn't change. We may have all these different wonderful technologies, but we should be very, very careful not to forget the principles, not to forget the ethical values that our profession is based on. This is the wall of my medical school at the entrance, where the Hippocrates Oath is, and actually our students, there's a modified version for the students when they get into medical school, and then of course when they finish and they are medical doctors, they do it again. But this is something that we should never forget, and there are many students listening now, and that this is the basis of our profession. And this has to do with humanism and medicine. And in this age of COVID-19, there's been a renewing focus on communication and compassion. And this is something that, as medical professionals, as medical educators, it should never disappear, never, regardless of wonderful technologies that we may be able, and certainly in 10 years from now, 20 years from now, I cannot even imagine what 50 years from now will be the practice of medicine. This is what's happening now, in COVID areas, and who's treating these patients as we are here, we know what this is. And even in extremes, we have to continue to have this compassion, this ethical attitude towards our patients. These are patients saying goodbye to their families just before being intubated to be ventilated because of COVID. And this is also the other side of the coin, which has been the tragedy of many health professionals that have been killed during this tragedy. And what is even more, and this is something that we as medical community also should very strongly fight, which is this whole concept of fake news, if you will, what I call the second pandemic, which is misinformation, and certainly has had a negative impact in our populations, in the way that we are dealing with now with this situation, but with other, this always happened. Now is more evident because we're dealing with the global problem. And again here, responsibility of us as medical educators, as medical professionals to fight this, because this is certainly probably an even more dangerous virus than the one that we are currently fighting. So, dear friends, dear colleagues, dear students, if I could summarize, and this is my last slide, the 10 challenges for medicine in the 21st century. I know this is not very humbling, but I would say, of course, I've spoken a lot in the previous minutes, but now I'm just putting it in a summarized way. Promoting healthy lifestyles and healthy environments, dealing with air pollution, healthy cities. There is a big program of WHO, as many of you know and may be involved. So prevention. We have to have healthy societies. And the only way to do that is, of course, not only having the decision makers, the governments, the institutions involved, but we as medical profession, we have to be the gatekeepers of the knowledge that can be used to make healthier societies. Then if we move into disease, we are doctors, we like to treat disease. Early detection is fundamental. If we detect early disease, we can treat it better, and we can change the natural history of any disease process. So identifying early markers of disease from genomics, biomarkers, whatever, and new prognostic markers as well, because prognosis is also very relevant, I would say is the second challenge. The third one, identification of new surrogates of disease. And again, this is evolving in terms of knowledge and where technology can be used. Developing new targets, new molecules, that's what we're doing all the time, trying to identify how we can do a better job in treating a certain condition. We can only do that if we understand the pathophysiology that is underlying all the disease that we have to treat. Technology developments in diagnosis, like the use of molecular imaging, but many others, is certainly continue to be a challenge for the future, as well as technology developments in treatment. I'm giving an example from my area, the artificial heart, which is already a reality, but the big reality will be a biological heart by using regeneration medicine and regenerative science to help to develop this and implement this concept, and many others, of course. Remote monitoring and treatment, the whole concept of digital health, I just showed a little bit, gave you a glimpse on that. And then very important, society versus medical goals for disease as a whole, fighting inequalities on healthcare access. And this is something which we are currently living. And the whole concept of vaccination, for instance, right now, is very important, that is seen as, and WHO is alerting for that, that should be seen as a global problem. We can only overcome the current situation if we have a strong global vaccination program, not only for Western countries, but or developed countries, but for the whole world. Otherwise, we will never be able to get over this. And finally, and it was mentioned a little bit, and certainly that we may discuss, I do believe that we should have harmonization of training. Harmonization does not mean that we all have to do the same, but we should be, and of course there are many organizations, FEAM is one of them, but many organizations dealing with this either at the specialty level or at different levels. But it's very important that we discuss, we exchange ideas, and we try our best to have harmonization of education, of training from pre to postgraduate in the medical field. I think that will be fundamental now with all the different ways that no borders. Of course, now we're living differently, but that will go back again to the period where there will be no borders, so the patients, medical doctors can go to any country. It's very important that we guarantee harmonization of training to our future professionals. So it was a real privilege to give this conference. I hope I just gave you a little bit of food for thought on some of the areas that at least I see as some of the huge challenges that we have in the future. And that comes together, practice of medicine, medical education, they have to be together, and they have to be together in a modern way, in a way that we can look into the future with confidence and bring this confidence to our populations, which at the end is our ultimate goal, is to have healthy populations and to treat properly our populations so they can continue develop their happiness. And thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Pinto, for that very interesting discussion. We have one statement really from the audience, which is from David Oliver. He says, thank you. Although all the technological issues are helpful, the most important issue for doctors is communication, which will be as important, if not more so, as we will have to encourage people to change their lifestyle, cope with disability and psychological mental health issues. The pandemic has also shown how the poor and disadvantaged have been particularly at risk and need more help to cope and change.
Well, I think that's a great comment, and I totally agree and underline that comment. I think I showed that a little bit. Of course, I had to cover different aspects, or I felt that I had to cover those different aspects. But communication, we in our medical school, for some years now that we've developed this area, which has different components of developing communication skills with our students. And certainly this has been one area that needs our attention, and it will need also to be more reinforced, particularly in the world that we live today. So I totally agree with the comment. I do think this is one area that I know that in many medical schools it's being implemented, this communication skills, because that's something that in a more conventional way maybe has not been so well approached, but it's something that many of us medical educators have been very attentive to, and have been doing, I would say, what can be done also, because, what is an interesting aspect we discuss, and many of us have been around for many years now. I'm not saying I'm old, but I've been around for some years now. And many of the discussions, we have the solutions. The problem is implementing those solutions. And of course, to implement those solutions timely, because, science, medicine evolves very fast. So it's a big challenge also, not only to identify the problem, to find the solution, but then implement it in a timely way. And that's also a challenge in all different aspects for medical schools, for universities to work with.
Okay, and maybe we have time just for one more. This is coming in from George Casimir. He says that some countries organize basic science programs for all scientific orientations, including medicine, but there's a great heterogeneity in Europe. He says he thinks it's very important that the 3 first years give solid bases in basic science, scientific reasoning, and introduction to research, even for future GPs, to improve the quality of training.
Yeah, I also agree with this comment, but we have to, and it's a discussion I just touched upon very briefly, which is a discussion that has been ongoing for many years. We have a different system in Europe, at least most of European countries, if not, I would say almost all of them, compared with the US. In the US, they have the 2-tier approach. So they have the college, where you basically have, if you go into a scientific field, which could be medicine, but could be any other field, you have 4 years where you have all your, let's say, basic education. And then you go into medical school, for instance, where you have 4 additional years where you more focus on medical aspects. This is one model, which is the American model. In Europe, most countries have 6 years. So once you finish secondary school, you go into the medical school immediately, and you have 6 years medical school. And it has been changing the way, and even now, there are different types of organization of the curriculum. For instance, here in our medical school, for some years now, we have a modular curriculum where we already are not doing the classical, which I had when I was a medical student. You start with anatomy, then you go 3 years just basic science, and then in the 4th year you start. It's the first time you'll see a patient. Now it's becoming different, although of course you still have to go through the concepts of anatomy, biology, biochemistry, and so on, but these are more integrated into a more modular way. And the students from the first year, they start to have some contact with patients, and more, these concepts are being changed. So although I agree that it's important to have a solid scientific basis for a medical student, there are different models. I do think the modular model, so growing in a cross-sectional way, it's a model that I favor more than doing it in a more longitudinal way. But I know this is an area of discussion, and certainly it's one area that we will continue to discuss in the future. But I'm more in favor of the European model than the American model, although I do see also some advantages in the American model, particularly, this aspect of maybe having a more solid initial development in very basic concepts. But for medical students, and again, my concept is that medical schools, not necessarily only for, but mostly for educating future medical doctors. That's the way I see it. I know this is arguable. I know many colleagues have different opinion, but we do have other schools where if you want to do some other, and you want to follow any other career, you can do that. In medical schools, it should include, of course, all the scientific elements and all the contents that can make a medical doctor. But I do believe that they should be focused mostly on preparing future medical doctors with a scientific basis. Of course, now there is the buzzword of science evidence based education, which I think it's obvious. But still, I believe that medical schools should be focusing on educating and preparing the future medical doctors for the community.
Thank you very much. I'll pass over to Maria now. Maria, you're on mute, sorry.
Yes, thank you very much. Our second speaker will be Professor Stefan Constantinescu. He teaches molecular and cell biology at University Catholic Leuven. He is the head of at the research unit in cell signaling at DUV and DUV Institute. It's not easy, these names. And at Ludwig Institute for Cancer Research in Brussels. He is a member of the Royal Academy of Medicine of Belgium and of the Romanian Academy. He is actually a FEAM Vice President. His conference will be on the integration of academic medicine in medical practice. Professor Stefan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful and honored to have a chance to present my thoughts on this extremely interesting topic within the large chapter of academic medicine, which is the integration of academic medicine in medical practice. Now, I will try in the next 20 minutes or so to present you my vision, which is mainly of a basic researcher that does a part of his time clinical medicine, especially in molecular hematology and malignant hematology. And I have had the privilege to live in 3 different medical systems. I started in Romania with the medical system in Romania, University of Medicine and Pharmacy in Bucharest. I then went ahead and spent more than 10 years in the United States, essentially at MIT, and then I came back to an old European university, the University of Leuven in Belgium. So I believe that I have experienced 3 different systems, which are of course interrelated. And after all that experience, I have now the opportunity to deliver a few conclusions and suggestions. Now, the definition of academic medicine in itself is quite broad because it encompasses teaching at all levels of medicine, from undergraduate to graduate to postgraduate. And it also involves research, both in the basic and clinical, and all integrated in delivering medical practice, but in an academic setting. And to be clear, the English word academic does not mean Academy of Science, Royal Society or French Academy or whatever. It involves university setting. So the English word used here is for a university, high level of education setting. And the best ingredients for medical progress and excellence in medical practice remain the combination of teaching and research. Now, one of the questions that has been asked by the organizers of the meeting was what kind of doctor we want to have. And I think that we all would like to be treated by an empathic doctor that places the patient first, that would bring to the patient the best care possible afforded by the current scientific knowledge. And in an ideal world, like Sir Francis Bacon would have said, you know, that doctor should have contributed to some of the progress that he delivers or she delivers. But this is, of course, extremely difficult. And in the same time, the same person should bring back to the research labs interesting and provocative clinical observations. This is, to me, an ideal situation. Of course, very hard to achieve that. Now, in the current day and age, patients themselves become more and more educated. They are digitally educated. They read a lot on the internet. Some of them have scientific backgrounds. And sometimes they learn a lot about their disease, and it becomes a very important part to really interact with the patient. We all know in the clinical world that if you listen carefully to the patient, 75% of the diagnostic is there for you. So you have to listen to the patient. But today it becomes more difficult because patients have more and more detailed information, perhaps not all in the right context, but that is a change from the past. So the questions that I'm asking are the following. Does academic medicine impact medical practice? That is, what happens in the university setting, in a city, somewhere, does it really impact medical practice everywhere in the country? And then the second question, is the teaching part sufficient for academic medicine? So if you have a great medical doctor and you teach some of what you do, is that sufficient for creating an academic medicine environment? And then, is teaching medicine independent of research? I think that there are very serious questions, and of course, we're not going to be able to answer them in this setting, but I'm going to try to tell you what my position is and argue for this. Of course, I could be wrong. For the first questions, yes and yes. I mean, yes and yes. Of course, if you have high-level academic medicine, you will have good practice around. There is no doubt about it. Is the teaching part sufficient for academic medicine? I would say no. Is teaching independent of research in academic medicine? I think also no. But of course, I could be wrong. Now, one of the major aspects of medical practice comes from learning, and most of our students learn from textbooks and courses, PowerPoint presentations, but all of those are based on medical literature, which is composed on primary research papers. And so I think in the curriculum in the first years, the students should be taught by someone to go to the reference list of the chapter they study and then go to the original reference, check that reference, see how it was validated, and then learn how to check the validity of published data and the relevance to the clinics, and always develop this reflex of going to the sources of the notions that you learn. Now, academic medicine, of course, is in the business of teaching how to interpret published results, but also how to contribute to research advances. So this should be on the mind of every doctor, that if she or he observe something very important, they should share that and study that. And of course, during the medical curriculum, we have to teach the physicians to learn to write their observations, because it's not enough only to make them, but be able to organize them in writing. And so medical practice is a never-ending learning process. The most advanced specialists learn more than their students. Ideally, medical doctors should contribute to the medical progress, not only benefit from it. And then original observations and research-minded practice always correlate with clinical excellence. So it is in the interest of the patients to develop those skills. Now, this relationship between research and academic medicine which research is also part of academic medicine, but then there is a basic research, pure molecular research. And so if we take the whole medical research, I would say that it comprises both clinical and basic research, and it's a two-way street. Why? Because major clinical observations inspire research and can come from academic and non-academic medicine. And then, of course, you have to integrate these observations into experimental settings and then get back to the patient into a form of a result that is deliverable. Now, the culture of seeking original observations is a fundamental part of teaching medicine well. Now, of course, this requires that the student or the fellow or the doctor has solid knowledge and background, requires honesty and an open mind, requires a certain level of scientific culture, not to confuse novelty with unknown facts to oneself, and of course requires communication skills with basic laboratories. Now, I would like to also say that the mindset of a basic researcher and a clinician are not the same, and we have to recognize that. So for basic research, a successful project is to solve a problem. And that sentence is on the walls of the quadrangle building at Harvard Medical School on Longwood Avenue. That a PhD is not to contemplate a problem, not to better describe a problem, but to actually solve a problem. Now, that is different because in clinical practice, we cannot always solve a problem. We are faced with very difficult problems that are likely to stand with us for a long time. And in clinical world, better understanding and defining a problem are valid approaches. And trying to completely solve a problem in the clinical setting is not realistic. But in the basic research, we don't want to cultivate a perpetual contemplation and a descriptive attitude. And so that is why it's extremely important that those physicians that do basic research and those researchers that do clinics do not cross-borrow these mindsets, because they're not the same. And of course, it's very easy in basic research to contemplate forever a problem and never solve it. And so we should avoid that. So I would say that the practice of medicine and the study of the university activities have shown that original research advances are obligatory for academics in medical schools. To obtain a faculty position, usually you have to be part of the academic world and you have to have done something of impact in that world. And so by definition, academic medicine requires a research effort. And I will say that is my main message of this presentation, is that teaching by academics to non-academic and students, staff and fellows, requires not only to transmit notions, approaches, and concepts, but also the spirit that led to the discovery of those notions, formulation of concepts and novel approaches. So it's really important to transmit that attempt to always explain, to always test, because this is what led to the notions that are studied and on which exams are based. Now, this question of research in academic medicine has been on the mind of many politicians, administrators of universities, foundations, and many countries made strong efforts to stimulate medical students and medical doctors to undertake basic research, and later on, clinicians to participate in clinical research and basic projects. So the first of those were United States universities, and I have been contemporary in the US with this things in the 90s. They created MD, PhD programs, and you know, in the US, MD studies are extremely expensive. It can cost $100,000 per year for the student to go to medical school. But if the student would successfully get into a PhD program as well, this MD, PhD package would be completely funded by fellowship. So some of the best minds went into this because it was really a big advantage. Similar programs were created as well in certain countries in Europe. And that led us to have two models in academic medicine. One was a model in which an MD gets first his full clinical training and specialty, and then gets a PhD in basic biomedical research. Second model is to interrupt the clinical training and do PhD either just after finishing medical studies or during the last years, and having some way to compensate the PhD years into the clinical years. And I think those two models are now being tested, because we're going to see what progress did they lead to. And that raises a very important question, and that is, can one person be both highly specialized in clinical and basic medicine? That is, of course, the ideal of the system one, where you have one person that in the morning does the highest possible clinical medicine, including surgery, and in the afternoon checks for genes and proteins in cells, injects animals, and does imaging. It's very hard. The old model, which led to the advances that we are benefiting from now, are from the best clinician that has the most experience in the clinical world, collaborating with the best researcher, and then putting the two together. So I would say that both systems work. I think that the system one is almost utopic in my mind. I think in the system two, what would be good to do is to train in research the clinicians, and in some clinical parts the researchers, so that they have the same language. Both systems again can work. And then recently two more partners joined effort into this. The third partner is the non-academic MD, because a lot of observations in the clinical world can come from non-academic MDs coming to academic centers and collaborating with them. And the fourth, of course, is the patient herself or himself. So the real integration, if we want to progress, is from the academic clinician, basic researcher, with the non-academic clinician and the patient. And so these four participants have been put into movement recently by the development of bioinformatics, because now big data become democratically usable through the bioinformatics and through the artificial intelligence. And then we can have more actors feeding in data, because the rate limiting step now is not what it used to be, but it's really the interesting observations. Now, the development of bioinformatics coincided with the development of what we call genomic precision medicine. As you know, in the 90s, researchers have sequenced the human genome, which costed more than 1.5 billion. And we identified the 3 billion pairs of bases in the human genome, the 30,000 genes. We understood that we have a lot of repetitive elements, transposon sequences coming from bacteria and viruses. And we understood also that we have more than 95% in our genome as non-coding. Yet that sort of non-coding ocean of sequences are highly relevant to the coding part of the genome. So if we compare the ocean, this is the non-coding sequence. And then the 2 to 5% are these boats that we are actually having here, which are the metaphor for messenger RNAs that are translated into protein, which are going to achieve our function. Now, diseases are due to problems in the genes, in the 30,000 genes, but also to storms and tsunamis in the rest of the ocean of our genome. And we are just beginning to learn about the mutations in the genes, and our laboratory has been quite active in identifying driver mutations of blood malignancies, blood cancers, which now are diagnostic criteria of the World Health Organization for different diseases. But we are just at the beginning of the knowledge of how the genome in its entirety influences what is the most important thing, and that is the differentiation of tissues. because we have 30,000 genes, but not all 30,000 are expressed in all cells. And the choice by which one or the other of the gene is expressed is at the basis of the differentiation. And that is at the source of a lot of the diseases, primarily, of course, cancer, which is a differentiation defect. And so now, because we have sequenced so many genomes of so many species, and we can retrieve quite quickly mutations, we have now a whole new language, a whole new anatomy. Indeed, as Professor Pinto said, at our time, we were learning all the muscles, all the bones, and some of our professors forced us to learn also the discoverers of those bones and muscles and tendons, and all the topographical relative position of those. But now there is a new anatomy, and this is the anatomy of the genome. And so we have now these major advances of next generation sequencing, which allows us to sequence now a whole genome in less than a day. We can do whole exomes, tens, hundreds a day. We can do whole RNA sequencing, which allows us to see which genes are expressed and which mutations they have. And we can compare that with the whole exome sequencing and get very accurate data. And we have a lot of other technologies that I'm not going to get into, where we can even sequence the epigenetic marks of the genome, and also do that on circulating DNA liberated by tumors. So all that, of course, is going to indicate that the future is quite bright for medicine, because it really enters into a much more scientifically based Cartesian time. So a lot more will be discovered earlier to the benefit of the patients, and that has already started to change medicine. But of course, the unmet medical needs that we are all facing, from Alzheimer's to Parkinson to very hard to treat cancers and other diseases, these unmet medical needs motivate many academic and non-academic physicians in their pursuit of original observations. But also the unmet medical needs are putting a pressure on the system, and maybe this biases a little bit the funding of biomedical research, because if somebody is claiming that through one approach a big problem will be solved, I have seen, unfortunately, that both in the United States and Europe, sometimes those unrealistic claims are actually funded ahead of serious research projects. And so how do we fight with this? Well, we have to develop a critical spirit among the MDs in training, so that they themselves, when they arrive at the position to decide what should be funded by society, they have the scientific basis to be realistic and really not allow unfunded claims to be really pursued. Now, the advances in bioinformatics and genetics are impacting the integration of academic medicine to practice, because most diseases will have precise molecular causes, will have markers. Most treatments, or some at least, will be tailored, targeted, and administered as a function of the genetic markers and the genetic disposition to metabolize the drugs. And there will be early screening methods with periodic checks with cards, and listing genome variations will become routine in identifying potential causes of disease. So what are the consequences? Well, medical practice becomes less of a mystery and more of an open book. A lot of MDs will analyze together with the patient the decisions and the outcome. We will sort of change a little bit from the priest-like physician to more of a science-based approach. And then patients, as I said, could be in certain aspects more knowledgeable than the MDs, be more aware of recent clinical trials and progress. And so the medical practice will resemble more and more scientific practice. And then the non-academic practice will either raise up to certain academic standards or will diminish in importance, because the patients will become more and more exigent. And so that puts a huge burden on medical schools, because medical schools need to match the best training, because a medical student from any country could take a course from the best university in the world and compare to the quality of the course delivered by his own teachers. The same thing will happen with medical specialty training programs, will need to match higher exigence levels. And so the best way to stay ahead and cultivate this scientifically driven approach is to cultivate the research approaches in medical school early. So students are trained to learn and assess continuously, read primary papers, not be afraid of scientific figures. And so it is this new doctor that will integrate progress in all areas of genetics, epigenetics, markers, and informatics into delivering the best care. And then the intellectual approach required for future medical practice will combine the current clinical medicine with the basic research knowledge. And so we will move to a more complex requirement from the doctor, not only to deliver in a humane way clinical care, but also integrate the latest advances. So now I'm going to end with two controversial slides. The first one is that currently MDs and specialists from any European Union country are free to obtain equivalences and practice in any other European Union country. So if you have a diploma of a medical doctor of any of the accredited medical schools in the European Union, you could practice anywhere. More so, specialty programs are recognized. So you can take the most advanced neurosurgery program and place this neurosurgeon from the west to the east and from the east to the west of the European Union. So the question is that reasonable? Is training similar? Is it okay for MD diploma but not for specialty? Is it okay for specialty and MD diploma? I am skeptical, and I think that although we don't want to approach this question, which is delicate and involves complicated negotiations, I think we will need to think about it, at least in academic setting, and establish some standards that everybody else has to respect in Europe, at least in European Union, and probably in a mutual understanding with the United Kingdom, which obviously remains in the European Union with respect to science, medicine, and other important aspects. So there is a quote that is attributed either to Paul Valéry in his book Our Destiny and Literature, or to Laura Riding and Robert Graves in a piece called Private Correspondence on Reality, published in Epilogue, both in 1937. And then the quote is either the future, like everything else, is no longer quite what it used to be, or the future is not what it used to be. And I think that this is today quite true, because both the progress in informatics and the pandemics are changing a lot our vision about life. And I hope that we will focus, all of us together, to solve these problems in at least our areas of expertise. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Constantinescu. We have a question from Marco Carvalho. He says, high-level research is very expensive and probably not all medical schools will be able to offer the best research practices for their students. How do we deal with this reality?
Well, I think that studying research papers is available everywhere. And then those that are the best students could be sent during their summer vacations of the first 3 years, when they don't do that much clinical work, to spend internships of, let's say, 2 months in top research universities in the world. That kind of investment, which is minimal financially, it's something like 10,000 euro or something like that, and you can select the best 10 students that you have. That helps a lot because people will see how a lab functions. It's outside of the curriculum time, and then combining that with teaching scientific reading and scientific paper reading, that can work, I think. Of course, not all medical schools will have fantastic research laboratories, but all countries have very good labs in institutes and other places. It's just a matter of carving out some time for the best students and sending them there for a period where they are not taking exams, courses, and seminars. That would be my suggestion, together with the fact that the medical curriculum today is hugely charged. So somehow those people that designed the time of students made sure that there is not even 1 minute free. So they are busy every minute of their life. They don't have time to reflect. And I think we should a little bit clean that to leave what's more important and then give credits. And if somebody wants to do 2 months of research somewhere or take 4 hours a week to do research or 8 hours a week, we should not have them take all the courses. And this is not my idea. This is an idea that I have to quote from one of the great scientists and physicians, Christian de Duve, Nobel Prize 1974, who told us that in his time, medical students were not as busy as they are today. And so he did also chemistry in parallel. And during his medical studies, discovered glucagon, for example, as a side project. So if you do it well and you do not fill up the auditoria with students 12 hours a day, you may have a chance to get those students to do something interesting.
Thank you. I think that's a very important point about not overloading medical students. We have a message from Dominique Brown. She says, thank you to both of you, very inspiring lectures. And I will now pass back to Maria. Maria, thank you.
No more questions, Catherine?
Okay, I was trying to keep time, but maybe we can fit one more.
2 minutes.
Okay, we can do one quick one. We have a message from George Casimir. He says, could you summarize your very important message? We have probably passed our education if medical students have passion for science, doubt as basis of reflection, and willingness to understand.
I would agree that is the conclusion. I think that my main message was that students are now under the impression that if they would learn everything that exists today, that would be wonderful. And that is, they think that because they cannot remember everything, they're not good doctors. The reality is that the big problem is not to learn everything that other people did, but for yourself to do something that contributes to what everybody else learns. And that is the fundamental problem that we have to bring into the spirit of students, that learning by heart the course is not the key point. Learning by heart the book onto which the course is based is great, but contributing to something that will be in the next book would be the point. And I think that this is our challenge and we have to raise up to that.
Okay, thank you. Maria, do you want to?
Okay, thank you, Caroline. Well, so we are aware of the changing face of medicine. We know that we have to stimulate research in medical practice, but do not forget to teach our students empathy, compassion, understanding, teamwork, and I think, in my opinion, it's very important, role models. Allow me to quote William Chase from Stanford University. He says, students forget in 2 weeks what you taught them, but they never forget the kind of teacher or the kind of doctor you are. So the next panel, led by Professor Manuel Sobrinho Simões, will be on what kind of doctor we want to have in the future. Professor Manuel Sobrinho Simões is an emeritus professor of pathology in Oporto Medical Faculty and director of IPATIMUP, a research institute created in 1989. Manuel was also president of the European Society of Pathology. Manuel, the floor is yours.
Good morning. It's a pleasure. Thank you very much for, I think this was a very good idea to have this initiative. It was very good to hear these two presentations because, of course, they show the diversity of the world. And it's very difficult for us to go back to discuss how should we teach the medical students, and that is what we are here. And the reason why I was invited is because we are doing this in Portugal. We are doing a lot in clinical academic centers. And even in the small country like Portugal, it is a very different society in North Portugal or in the Lisbon or in Algarve. And I am imagining how it is throughout the world and even in Europe. So, first point, I just have 5 minutes and I just want to, in a way, the trigger for the discussion with the panel members. So I agree that we should go for understanding and competence. And we need understanding and competence means not only, of course, the basis of science, but also communication, empathy, social, cultural skills. This is more and more important. And the reason why I'm mentioning this, it's because we know that a person, like a patient, is not just a bunch of genes. By the way, even me, I'm a diagnostic, I diagnose cancer. And even a cancer is not just a bunch of genes. It's much more than the genes. And this is important for medical students to understand that. So this is my first point. I would like to discuss this. Second point is, of course, it is very, very important to realize that there are two different things. One is the patient itself as a person, and then, of course, we have the community. And it's crucial to understand the difference between the tree and the forest. And this is a crucial point in terms of medical education. My last point is that I do pathology. I do a lot of molecular pathology. I don't think we should say about, that is not molecular medicine. That's very bad to say medicine. I mean, molecular medicine, it's the same as saying digital medicine. There is not that digital medicine. But I mean, there is not nano medicine. And the point is because, of course, we have the tools. We have to learn how to use the tools. And this is, of course, digital tools are crucial. Big data is crucial. Fair enough. But my point is, when we are going to teach medical students, we would like to make them doctors, not just the glorified technicians. A doctor is much more than a glorified technician. By the way, in Portugal, they are badly paid. So that are not only glorified technicians, but they are also very, very badly paid. So let's see what the panel. So I asked Corinne to go ahead with the panel members. And thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Simwish. Okay, I will just briefly introduce the panel. Professor Jean Sibilia is the Dean of the Faculty of Medicine at Strasbourg since 2011. He has been the President and the Vice President of the National Conference of Deans, and he is also the co-head of the National Reference Centre for Systemic Autoimmune Diseases at Strasbourg University Hospital. We also have Professor Jenny Higgum. She is the Principal of St. George's at the University of London, and she is also the first female chair of the Medical Schools Council for the UK, and she is a practicing gynecologist. We have Professor Julio Mayol, is this Professor of Surgery at the Universidad Complutense de Madrid and Chief Medical and Innovation Officer at Hospital Clínico San Carlos. He is also the Secretary of the BJS Society and Digital Media and Innovations Editor of Surgery Journal and the President of the Spanish Society of Surgical Research. I'd also like to welcome Alexandra Archidulakis, who is the European Medical Students Association's Vice President of External Affairs, and she is in her 5th year of medical school at the Charité Universität Medicine, Berlin. Thank you all very, very much for being here today. To start off, maybe let's talk about the training of doctors in various European member states. We already mentioned this with Professor Pinto earlier on today. So all European member states organize their own training of doctors. Should this be continued in the future, or would it be better to maybe have a common EU curriculum and exam? So Professor Simoes, maybe I'll go straight to you first and see what you think about this. Sorry, I think you're muted.
So, I mean, we have been discussing this in several aspects, and I'm not sure. As a matter of fact, my problem is, I wonder if you could, I would like to listen first to the panel members, and because I, as a pathologist, and my training as a pathologist, I'm not sure how to deal with this. I'm sorry to say this, but I'm not sure.
Okay, no problem. Professor George Griffin, let's go to you for this then. I'm so sorry, Professor, you're on mute.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
We can.
Good, good. Well, this actually, it looks a simple question, but it's very complex. And it's complex for lots of reasons, of course. Many different countries, and just the practicality of being able to do it. But Stefan mentioned this, of course, in his talk at the end, and Professor Simoes in pathology mentioned this as well as being very, very complex. Ideally, of course, the answer is yes. And there is a basic need of equivalence for doctors. And this would be, I suppose, called minimal education and standards. But of course, we should be aiming for more than that. We should be aiming for excellence. This is very difficult to achieve because some people are excellent, some people are not excellent and just stay at this minimal level. So my view, to be pragmatic, would be, yes, I think it would be a very, very good idea to have the same standards throughout Europe. And you could certainly say in pathology, this is absolutely crucial for diagnosing tumors, for diagnosing hematological malignancies, because when you have that consistency, you can then use a consistency of treatment. So the answer, I think, is yes, it would be great, but there are still obstacles in achieving that. Over.
Can I go back now? Because
yes,
yes, I can hear you.
I think, because as you said, the pathology is particularly easy. So apparently, it is particularly easy because we can evaluate objectively throughout the countries. This is much easier when it comes to pathology, for instance, to clinical, for instance, if the person is evaluating how to deal with a clinical problem. Because for us, of course, problem in Europe, we were able in pathology, we, European Society of Pathology, we are able to make a European examination, and we are good at that because they are based upon images, informations, but we are not talking. We go back to our discussing in the first lectures, is the problem of communication, of social, cultural limitations and advantages. How are we going to deal with the topography of the place and the cultural and the civilization? And this, I think, it's extremely difficult. In pathology, it's much easier, and we are using it in a fairly well, fairly well, despite being complex, as you said. But I agree with you, we should try to go towards that. But I don't know how to do it. I'm sorry.
It is difficult. I just, to go on with that, I very, very much enjoyed Stefan's talk. One thing he didn't say, in my opinion, was that there is an equivalence between basic research and clinical medicine. And the equivalence is asking a question. And I'm an MD, PhD, and I've worked in the States. And it's a great privilege, of course, to be a clinician. But essentially, what a clinician is doing is seeing a patient and asking the question, what is wrong with this patient? A researcher asks a very discrete focused question. What, for example, is the gene that's wrong in polycystic disease or whatever? But it's the ability to say, I'm asking a question, and I ask one question at a time, and then I integrate all of the solutions that I got to make a final conclusion. And in clinical medicine, that actually is what we're doing. We're integrating many, many aspects about a human being, their social circumstance, their disability, and their specific reason for coming to see a doctor. And all of those things go together. And the beauty of medicine, of course, and the privilege of medicine is that we can do that for our fellow citizens. And we use the science that we've got to actually come to a conclusion for the benefit of the patient, not for the benefit of the doctor.
Maybe I'll just ask Professor Constantinescu if he wants to add anything there.
Thank you, George. Yes, this is what was missing, and I will put it in the presentation and cite you, because you actually really nailed it. I think that's basically the question that should have been asked. And coming back to the problem of the equivalence, indeed, it's very difficult. I mean, the United States has taken the step of having the USMLE ECFMG that some of us had to go through, which basically is an equivalence at the MD level. But then the specialties are state specific. So even in the US, you have the Board of Internal Medicine of Texas, and if you're licensed in Texas, you're not in Washington or in Massachusetts. So basically, that problem is not easy to solve. And I would say that while it's very difficult to do this equivalence at the specialist level, perhaps we should first think about the basic medical degree, sort of like a driver's license type of thing, and then let each country and each system of academic training do its job.
May I add just a short comment here, because I think this is a crucial discussion, and the fact that I think we agree on that, the need, this is certainly a need to have, for all the reasons that were already mentioned, that we need some harmonization. Harmonization does not mean that we all have to have the same curricula or exactly the same model. Actually, it should be different. The offers should be different. But the principles and the standards, as Professor Griffin mentioned, those should be common. And of course, that's the challenge. But I think medical academies here may have a role. And we are now among different members of different academies. And this is something to consider. It's not easy, but you know, we deal with so many difficult things. So this could be a challenge for the academies, for the European academies, to define some sort of common standards that then, of course, will be applied to the different that each university would have, and that's good to have different programs and different because it's obvious that a certain university may be more specialized in a certain area. That's normal. In the US, you see that I was at Stanford for some years, and it was a high-level place for a few areas that we knew that's going to be top and where people would come to be trained. But the standards and I think the more complex the medical field is becoming, and that's obvious, I think the more we should battle for this kind of standards. Again, doesn't have to be all the same, but basic standards that should also be the basis for confidence. And that was one of the issues that Stefan mentioned, the fact that it's true. You know, in the EU, our medical degrees, they are recognized by all the different countries. So this level of confidence that we should transmit to the population as well, it's something that should have a basis, and that basis should be some sort of common agreement. And I know in the specialties, Manuel mentioned pathology. In other fields also, we have already European exams and European diplomas, if you will. But for pre-graduate, I think it's a challenge that we should look very, very careful. And I take the opportunity to leave this challenge to our academies to think about it.
Also,
could I make a comment
Okay.
as well?
No, you go on.
So let's go first to Alexander and then to Jenny. Thank you very much.
Okay. I just wanted to quickly add something. So I think what Professor Pinto just said is really important, that we have like a basic understanding that that there's a basic curriculum which all the universities should adhere to. I think that's something that in Europe is being discussed and has been discussed for a while, and I hope that we will move towards that, because it would very much simplify accreditation processes. It would simplify the day-to-day activity in hospitals, that you can be sure that the student that comes in to residency has had these core subjects to the same extent as a student in your own country would. But also the aspect that you mentioned with flexibility, I think is extremely important, especially looking at, for example, Canada and the US. They are very much debating implementing social accountability more into medical education, which I personally think, and also members of my organization agree with, that is a really good thing to do. And I do think and hope that the European curriculum or the European agencies will also move towards that. And in order to allow for social accountability to be present and to be able to be implemented, there has to be a level of flexibility, because you can't presume that an issue which, for example, is present, or an illness which, for example, is present in Germany or more prominent in Romania or France, is also prominent in other countries to the same extent. So the medical schools would need the level of flexibility to be able to react to the society that they're primarily educating students for, not taking into consideration the medical mobility, of course, which should be upheld. So I completely agree with that, especially because of social accountability and also the idea of One Health and everything that we're moving towards. Also, generally speaking, I mean, the medical curriculum, I think we will also get to that at some point, is in need of reformation. Also, just looking at digitalization, for example, we need something to change. So that would be a really good opportunity to implement something which is like a guideline or a core curriculum, which is common across all European states, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you very much. Jenny, you had something to add? And then I'll go to the Q&A.
Yes, thank you very much. I think that quite apart from the challenges of everybody agreeing everything, I do think that often the context has to be also considered. Although it's laudable to consider something common, the more I speak to colleagues and have international experience, it is what we understand from one place and another and around training. It should relate. The purpose of medical school is to prepare you to be a good doctor, but that often is in the context of your own postgraduate environment, and that is not the same wherever you go. I think it relates to the previous speaker. And that your role within that health system and the level to which you're going to be trained thereafter does vary a great deal. And so I think that that's another challenge to a commonality of a document, because it has to be context specific to the healthcare systems which we're providing doctors to.
Okay, thank you very much, Jenny. And I just see that Julio, you have something to contribute here?
Yes, thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me to participate. And second, I think that the main problem here is we are approaching this in a silo way. We are trying to do things separately. We should be approaching this from a network approach, taking advantage of the digital tools we have now. We can reshape how we train doctors. First of all, we have to define what kind of product we want. Of course, I agree with that. And that's very contextual, of course. But then let's take advantage of a social network approach instead of this silo approach.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have a question from the Q&A that relates to One Health. So I'm just going to jump on it here. It's European doctors, dentists, pharmacists, and veterinarians have identified the need for implementation of One Health culture in university via implementation of interdisciplinary education. What is the opinion of the panel on this? So would anyone like to take that? Yeah, no problem.
Jenny, I think you had your hand up. You're muted. That's it.
Undoubtedly, interdisciplinarity and medicine in its delivery is a team sport, and doctors are a very important part of that team. I think what we need to do is inculcate a culture whereby people, regardless of their professional background, are operating at the top of their license, at the top of their register. So we want to deliver healthcare really effectively and efficiently in the best interests of patients. And the way that we do that is operated a system whereby the doctors are well trained around handling ambiguity, around handling complexity, around handling extremely complex conversations. People mock communication skills training when it is a reductive process, but believe you me, as a clinician, the complexity of conversation one has to have is even made more difficult with the absolute waterfall of information there is out there. And it's for the system provides the information. It is a really complicated conversation between the patient and their knowledge, and to help the doctor to help them navigate these types of decision-making processes. And so nobody is an individual in this context. Everybody is operating as part of a system, but it is for the doctor, I think, to operate at the very complex, ambiguous, and difficult end of that spectrum.
Okay, does anyone else want to comment on that?
Alexandra has a...
Yeah, I completely agree with that, especially in education. And I think one point which people seem to sometimes forget is, or that in our opinion at least, patients should also be included in that interdisciplinary education as teachers even. So we have certain faculties which are already doing that, where specifically speaking about communication skills, you have patients there who also give active feedback, who can also, together with the professor, tell you what you did right or what they would have imagined to be differently and that kind of stuff. And I think that goes a very, very long way, so that actually in the clinical setting, there have been occasions where professors could basically tell which faculty you went to just based on the way you spoke to patients, just based on the fact whether you had this training interdisciplinarily with patients present or not. And similarly, the same would go for any other healthcare profession, in my opinion. So we also advocate for interdisciplinary education to such an extent that we also try to work on the student level with the other healthcare professionals or healthcare student organizations. So we kind of, in a way, show our members that we are all in this together, in a sense, and we all have to work together to get the best patient outcome, which is also something that has been shown throughout the pandemic specifically. If you just had nurses without the doctors, that wouldn't work. If you just had doctors without the nurses, wouldn't work. Without pharmacists, wouldn't work. It's one system, it's one organism, so to speak, and we have to work together in kind of also in sync and synchronized. And if that is not implemented in medical education and not taught at that level, you can't really expect it to work later on. So I think that's extremely important to be implemented into the curriculum.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
May I just very, very shortly, because I think this One Health concept, which is relatively new, but it's the perfect setting for the universities to have a big word there, because what we are including here is not only about medicine, it's about veterinary, it's about actually what we are living now, being a zoonotic disease in a way, the COVID-19, the relationship with the animals, with all sorts of potential aggressiveness towards humans, all the concept about air pollution, for instance, air quality, where we have to work with the engineers, all the things related with artificial intelligence and digital health or digital medicine or whatever you want to call it. All these is the key for the future is certainly this multidisciplinary, which goes beyond what we are used with the word multidisciplinary in medicine. In medicine, when we talk about multidisciplinary, is among us, different specialties, different areas. One Health concept, and in the US, and actually it's a recommendation of CDC right now, and they've been working on that for quite a while. In Europe also, there's been some work done, and we are considering now actually to evolve this in our medical school to engage in a process where we can engage with other areas of knowledge, where we can work, because this is new, it's something that we're all learning still, how we can use all the resources we have to have One Health. And I have to say also, there's a political component here. And again, we as scientists, as medical community, as academicians, we really have to have a big stand on this, and because we bring the credibility to the future of concepts such as the One Health concept, which I think is going to be the future as well. That was a very good and very important question.
Stefan, I see your hand raised. Can you just keep it short and succinct, because we need to move on to the next section.
Just to say that in 2019, in June, the FEAM organized the One Health concept in Bucharest, Romania, where a number of universities started teaching One Health. But I think that at the FEAM level, we should put together an ideal course in One Health, which should be absolutely known by every medical student, notions from veterinary medicine, epidemiology, that should be at the basis and should be in the curriculum, like microbiology is, or infectious diseases. They should be there.
Okay, thank you very much. So since we touched on COVID-19 Professor Pinto, with yourself, I'm going to move on with that. So basically, has COVID-19 revealed some gaps in doctors' training already, and what should be done to make sure that our doctors are better prepared for this and future pandemics? I'm going to go to Professor Jean Sibilia first.
Thanks very much for the nice organization of this meeting. Thank you very much. There is probably a lot of lesson to learn, but we need also to consider that this virus story is not over today, and you need to learn other lessons. First, I have two general comments. In my opinion, we need probably to teach early the science of certainty concept, which is so wonderful explained, for example, by Edgar Morin, who is a famous French epistemologist. My second general comment is we need to explain to the medical and the health students the concept of syndemic or synergistic outbreak. And I agree totally with Maria and Stefan. You need to have to learn the concept and to teach the concept of One Health, and to learn to our students the concept of empathy and compassion. So syndemic develop on the health disparity caused by poverty, stress, and violence in population with a lot of biological interaction. And so this condition exacerbate greatly the prognosis and the burden of disease. That's for me the major two general comments, but I have also three practical considerations. And for me, the first consideration, the first point will be, we need to anticipate in the future our capacity to teach different and to adapt our learning methods. For example, in using digital tools, you need to do that during the time crisis. In the actual context, I think the best is to combine face-to-face and distance learning with a maximal interaction between students and teacher. To do that, we need also, it's an important point, to do that, we need also to help the student with digital difficulties, most frequently in relationship with economic difficulties. You need to understand that. The second point, we need to be able to, it's also a very important point in my point of view, we need to be able to transmit the good information during the crisis time, because there is a lot of a significant flow of important informations and controversies coming from the general newspaper and from the social networks, including a lot of fake news. And my last point, I think also we need to be able to understand and to take charge the psychosocial difficulties of our students. It was a big problem during it's today a big problem for the students. There is a real social and ethical fragility for which we don't have today the possibility to answer due to lack of sufficient human resources in our university. And you know, the psychological support system are already insufficient for the young students, especially for the most isolated of them. And this is it's very important in my faculty, and probably in other faculty. This will be today. This is today, and there will be a big problem during this time crisis.
Catherine, I wonder if Catherine, I wonder if I can make some comments there. I'd really love to go back to the mental health of doctors and students, particularly when I've said what I want to say. The One Health concept and COVID, I mean, you couldn't wish for a better example of a disease which has brought together all of the threads that we've been talking about today. Animal source of coronavirus. I must say, I'm an infectious disease clinician. An animal source of coronavirus, molecular biology sequencing the gene of the virus, without which we couldn't have got to the vaccines, the use of the vaccines and the immune response in the different age groups that we have been treating, and the extremely difficult care of patients, patients dying without being able to be with their loved ones seeing patients on an iPhone with masked up nurses and doctors around them. I mean, this is the very, very core of what we've been talking about today, in my view, from compassion, from high technology, from everything through to why are we doing this and how do we do it? And what a great privilege it is for doctors and nurses to do that. And in fact, the final thing, of course, is in that context, doctors and nurses have been in an environment when they could catch an infection, and many have died, of course. So that this embraces the whole of medicine and brings me back to Jean's point at the end of how can clinicians of all trainings cope with this? You know, immensely difficult. to do. And I'd like to ask Jean, who brought this up, how in his medical school are you trying to approach this and think of the health of the practitioners for the future? Jean.
Yes, we do that. We do that with a psychiatric department, and to do that. But it's very difficult because in the time crisis we have a lot of things to do, because you need to have emergency. We need to teach. We need to organize. It's very difficult to do that if you don't have prepared that before. And I think in the future, you need to discuss together to have something together to be ready for the next step. It's very difficult to do that, but we need to do that. It's the responsibility of the teacher, of the university, of the medical school to prepare the future.
But it's a very important point you raised, the health of students and the health of medical practitioners, and particularly mental health, of course, when we're dealing with such difficult, complex problems. And we feel lost sometimes. I mean, there's no doubt about that. And there's nothing to be ashamed of in feeling lost.
Alexander, I see you have your hand up. Would you like to comment there?
Yes, definitely. So I think it's very interesting that the issue of mental health was raised. It's extremely important. For me, it's just coincidentally, we have done a survey recently amongst medical students, and there will be a larger one coming up soon, asking exactly that question, how they're coping during the pandemic and how the mental health issues are. And we got some, distressing results where a lot of students have said that it's increasingly difficult for them during the pandemic, not only because of, homeschooling most of the time, but then on the other hand, being implemented in the hospitals and in patient care, but not fully. It's all very stressful. And we got some individual results which were very distressing, with students saying that they have, increased, not directly suicidal thoughts, but almost, so to speak. So it is very much the time to react now. And we are also trying to figure out a way how we as an organization can kind of support our members and their mental health. And it's very difficult. And I agree that there should be something coming from the universities. Now, I'm not in the university admissions board or administration, so I don't really have any jurisdiction or idea how to, and I wouldn't like to tell anyone how to do that. But I think it's very important to react to it, because not only, the homeschooling or, home office is already having an effect on everybody's mental health, no matter if it's a medical student or not. Everybody who hasn't seen their colleagues in a year, for example, it's stressful. And even more so if then, on the other hand, in our case, is being implemented into the patient care, but you can't go home to your families because then, you may be a vector for the disease. It's all very complicated, but it definitely needs to be addressed. And I think it's very nice that this was brought up. And it's very nice to see that some faculties are already doing that. In terms of the primary question of the difficulties that were shown throughout the pandemic, I think the digitalization is definitely an aspect. I think a lot of schools have already understood or implemented it, that digital tools, or the students need to know how to learn, how to use digital tools in the healthcare setting. But we also like to just point out that it's not just learning how to use it, but also teaching the students through these mechanisms. And the pandemic came and a lot of schools weren't ready for any kind of digital teaching, and it just showed a lot, and you could really tell. And there are even some years of students who are saying that they don't feel like they're prepared for their board exams at all, because a lot of the teachings have gotten lost because of the digital format and because there wasn't much preparation. Now, the question when this should be brought up, because that's also a different discussion, a very big discussion, whether this should be in primary medical school or in specialization. And that's a whole other issue, with a lot of institutions, also the CPME, for example, having given input on that. But also additionally to that, I think public health is also something that wasn't really implemented in a lot of medical schools. A lot of students didn't know how pandemic preparedness would even work. and also just the implementation of medical students into the healthcare setting that's differed a lot from country to country, from city to city. And they are being used, they are being implemented, and I think it's very useful for them to be implemented. They do help a lot, but it varies a lot, and there could have been a better maybe preparation. Maybe these lessons could be drawn for the future if, God forbid, anything like this happens again, that the schools are better prepared, that the students know which year of which studies goes into the healthcare setting when, and I think that would go a long way.
We have to remember that doctors are human beings and they get exactly the same illnesses.
Exactly.
Patients do. And I remember once being questioned by a patient when I was ill, and we were talking, and she said, "But you're a doctor, you don't get ill." You know, and it was an interesting paradox sitting there. Public health is something we could talk about as well. Fausto, I think you
I just have a short comment, because there is a whole new subject that was actually existing even before the pandemic, but had a huge increment with the pandemic, which is doctors' wellness. It's a concept that is, particularly in the US, I think more than in Europe, this concept, and even some universities and some hospitals have developed programs for doctors' wellness, and that had to do with the burnout and with a lot of other issues. And of course, now with the pandemic, there was a huge increment in the needs to reinforce this whole subject. I also have to say, and what Jen said is exactly what I think all of us are trying to do. We had our psychology units, or our psychology support units for the students. Those were significantly increased in the demand. And that was across the board. You know, I've been speaking with colleagues around the world, and this has been the same everywhere. And that shows again, and again, what Alexander said, I think is very appropriate. You know, it's a little bit the role of the academies also, again, to set some sort of recommendations. Of course, the way this can be followed may differ from place to place, but the need to have a student support cabinet or system or whatever, it's fundamental. I know that most, if not all of the universities have something, but this is something that it's really quite important, needed. And again, it increases also the feeling of safety and well-being of the students. But it should not stop at the students' level. It should go beyond. And this is where these new units, if you will, it's almost a specialty now. I've seen incredible programs, and the ones I know are in the US. Again, Stanford, they developed, Bob Arrington, the chief of medicine, they developed a very interesting program for doctors' wellness, because there is a feeling, not only a feeling, it's a reality that even beyond this pandemic, or despite this pandemic, this was a huge issue in the medical community, and we've seen that aggravated during this pandemic. So certainly one area where we should invest, and again, where the academies may have a role to set some recommendations.
Just a very small point, very small. It's not just about creating the programs, because as you said, they do exist, but it's also about students knowing about it, because funnily enough, there are medical schools where they exist, but because I don't know, because of the taboo around it or whatever, nobody knows that it exists unless they actively search for it, at which point it's kind of already a little too late. They should have known about it. So I think sometimes, even though it exists and schools may say, oh, we have that, you also kind of have to think about, well, do the students know that we have it? Which is a weird leap to take, but I think very necessary, as it showed recently, yeah.
Again, communication, good communication. Yeah, you're right.
Okay, I'm going to move next to the subject of digital skills, and actually we have a question from Brigitte Velkeniers on this, and she says, medical students of tomorrow are confronted with the acquisition of different competences, engineering and digital skills, scientific training, communication skills, manager skills. With the reduction of MD training to 6 years, this puts an unprecedented strain on the curricula. How do we cope with this problem?
Well,
Jenny, do you? Oh, sorry, George.
First of all, medical training for 6 years. Medical training is a lifelong experience. It doesn't finish when you have a medical degree. A medical degree, and it goes back, I think, to what we were talking about, that there should be core competence in disciplines, and we haven't, many schools have tried to define that, of course, and it's different between schools. But you don't just stop when you get a medical degree. That's the beginning, and we mustn't get the idea that when you've got your medical degree, you are then fully trained and that's it. You are beginning your training in life, really, and you choose the discipline that you wish to go into.
Mm-hmm. Okay, brilliant. Maybe we'll go to Julio Mail and then Alexander, please. Julio, I think you're muted. Yeah.
Sorry. I think George mentioned this before. We must train new doctors to ask the right questions. It's not about having a deep understanding of how machine learning or deep learning works. It's being able to ask engineers the right questions in order to get the right answers. Otherwise, we would be getting very precise but inaccurate answers. So we must train people, not just students, but residents, surgical trainees or medical trainees, and even patients to ask the right questions. And that makes a huge difference, because intelligence is not in the answers, it is in the questions.
Okay, brilliant. Let's go briefly to Alessandra and then to Jenny.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. So I think with the digitalization, there's, as I was saying before, a whole other conversation, because the skills that a surgeon will have digitally or have to have digitally are completely different than that of a general practitioner. However, the basic level, the very basic skills can kind of be boiled down, and I think that should be implemented into the medical curriculum. I don't think you need to teach someone how to use a Da Vinci robot, because that, if they don't want to do surgery, they don't need to know that. That's just a waste of, perfectly good time, which could be used for something else. However, with the skills with the length, that's a very big issue, because right now, if we're talking also about implementation of NCDs and stuff like that a little bit more and highlighting that, we're looking at expanding. We would technically have to expand the length to like 8 years or something like that. Now, if we want to stick with 6 years, I think reprioritization is a very, very big point, and we need to look again also in the century that we're in now. What is needed, what is necessary, what needs to be prioritized, where do the communication skills come in? Because as I was saying before shortly, that you can tell which school the student went to based on the communication skills. Similarly, you can tell which school they went to based on the anatomy skills, which, funnily enough, contradict each other. The students who had more communication skills most of the time had a little bit less anatomy classes, because somewhere the time had to be taken from somewhere. And I think the reprioritization is extremely important that we need to look at, especially also to implement digitalization, which is so important.
Jenny, I think
Jenny, over to you.
Thanks very much. I think the context of the question was mainly around overload and timing. I think that we, first of all, should be really enthusiastic about the future and technology and adaptation. What we're not perhaps so quite quick about is keeping up with what technology can do with us. And I think that often, say, for example, our assessment strategies or so on lag behind what is available technologically. But I would view this as very positive. We have really bright and enthusiastic people entering into medicine. They are our future, and they are the people that will adapt the technology, whether that's for education, delivery and training, and the security of knowing that in fact they don't need to store all the knowledge here. It's instantly and easily accessible. We should acknowledge that and adapt as a consequence. And secondly, in patient care delivery, there's enormous benefit around technology of empowering patients, giving information, and operating in a safe environment, say around prescribing. So the answer is, let's embrace technology. It is the future. Let's get people constantly working on making it better, but also adapt what we do in light of what technology can offer.
Well said, Jenny.
Yeah, and I mean, it's also important for us to understand how doctors can contribute to the development of technology. Sorry, Stefan, I see you have your hand up. Would you like to comment?
Right. So I just wanted to say that we will have to take the responsibility one day and decide that some things we no longer need to teach. I know it's hard. We don't want to give up anything, but it's becoming utopic to teach everything that we have been taught 30, 25 years ago. So we have to define things that everybody should know and should know by heart very well, instantly, so they don't have to think about it when they have a problem. They have to have immediate reaction. This is like a driver license type of thing. And then each university, each program, depending on which areas they are more developed, they can build on that. But we will need to really get rid of some things from the curriculum. And I know it's hard, but we have to do it.
Okay, I'm going to take some more questions now. I see we have one that says, I greatly appreciate the proposed ideas, but what can be done practically to implement these ideas? European medical school cultures are vastly different and there needs to be bridges between them. There may be many opportunities, but I don't believe the access to them is the same everywhere. I'm a medical student from Florence and we receive little to no help in going beyond simple lectures for clinical research and intercultural experiences. Would anyone like to take that question? Stefan, for you?
Sorry, I don't want to monopolize, but I would say that in every university, you have among the faculty people that publish and they're known in one niche field. I mean, they cannot have all the fields. So the students should learn this from those that do it well from their university, and from that open to the world.
Okay, Alexandra, you have something to add?
Yeah, that's the point raised here is very much what we are also concerned with. Well, because it's also coming from a medical student, but that's exactly the point. There is, as it was saying, the system is very different across Europe. It's even different within one country. You have one curriculum at one faculty, a different curriculum at another faculty. As in, they teach the same core elements, but the curriculum is different. And I mean, students, it's a very competitive process to get in. They don't always get in where they directly want to get in. And I feel what was said before with the linking the different universities and the specialists from different universities is extremely important. But that requires that level of openness from the faculty more than from the medical student, in my opinion, because the medical student can't really, or doesn't really have the room to ask the professor, hey, could you please link it to other, also talk to other students at other universities. I think that requires a level of initiative on the school side, and also on openness on the professor's side, also openness to communicate with the students on an eye-to-eye level without the high level of hierarchy. Maybe reducing that a little bit would also go a long way. And for now, at least, a lot of associations do that job to compensate for that. So you have a lot of national, international, whatever, medical associations, medical student associations who invite professors who are willing to do that to give lectures in an offline kind of format, not offline, but outside of the curriculum, which is how we compensate for it. But that shouldn't really be needed, in my opinion. So it's a very important thought to keep in mind.
I think the question was also addressing, how can we do this with different cultures, with different countries? But we are used to that. We have in our different specialties in medicine, in science, we have guidelines that are followed by international community. So we have common ground that we can explore, that we can develop. That particularly, and now talking in the setting of academies, that can organize, so it can provide recommendations. We are not saying here that the curriculum should be exactly the same in all different faculties or all different. No, it shouldn't actually. But there's a common ground, and I think we're going back to some of the things we discussed before. I don't see a problem at the level of medical education that we can find, and we should find actually. I think that's a need to have, and particularly if you want to talk in regions, in Europe, I think we need that. It will be positive if we should have some sort of guidelines, recommendations for medical education that could be followed by the different countries. And I don't see any it's actually the richness of having different cultures is actually important. That's one of the reasons why, for instance, it's so important that we as scientific or medical community have the input from labs, from schools, from universities around the world. So I do see this as a challenge, of course, but it's always been a challenge, but as an opportunity also to improve the way we can deliver medical education. And I think we have great things in Europe. We had the Erasmus program, which is fantastic. The mobility of students, the mobility of professors, of teachers, of researchers. We should promote that. We should ask for, and I know that there's been a lot of discussions. The minister is not here, but all of us are pushing in our countries to have more money for research, more money for education, or if you want, support for. And this is what we need. You know, this is what we need to create, is to create some sort of a common voice that then will have its own tunes, its own colors in different countries, which is nice. It's so great. And that's again the role of an academy, in my view, and particularly when we're dealing at the European level. That's something that we should try to do our best to promote, leaving then the autonomy, of course, for all the different schools or different universities, medical schools to design their own programs, but knowing there is a common ground that should be followed.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have one more question, which is, can you comment on the place of...
Julio's got his hand up.
Sorry?
Julio.
Yes, I wanted to highlight this this concept exposed by Fausto Pinto, by Professor Fausto Pinto, is diversity. We shouldn't abolish diversity. We have to encourage diversity. Otherwise, we would be really in a bad position. We need to have more diversity, to understand people, to put them together in order to make the system advance. Otherwise, we would be blocked by just one single-minded system.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so here we come with another comment. Can you comment on the place of social and human sciences and of humanities in the courses? In France, the reform of the second cycle is supposed to reinforce the place of social and human sciences. My question is, to which extent, taking into account the fact that the column is limited? So maybe Jean, do you want to take this one?
I don't hear the question, Catherine. Can you?
Sure, it's in the Q&A if you check there, but it's, can you comment on the place of social and human sciences and of humanities in courses?
It's the last question?
Yeah.
That's a, difficult to... It's a difficult question for me.
Okay. Well, no worries. If someone else wants to,
yes.
Jen, I see you.
I'll just say a couple of short comments. First of all, we're dealing with human beings and the public, and an understanding of the human state and a rich understanding of that is absolutely vital. And that so many determinants of health are societal or within the public domain. So it's absolutely essential. We need to know a lot about medicine, but we need to know even more about the place of individuals within society and their challenges.
Thank you. And Julio, I see you have something to say.
Yes, we pay a lot of attention to, we have paid a lot of attention to biology and little attention to behavioral sciences. And we need to understand how we work as society, and because people don't get ill in isolation. They do that within a context, with families, relatives, other friends. So we need to understand how we behave and why, and how that behavior impacts our health.
You know,
I agree. I think this is part of what we can call the soft skills. And there's a whole set of different soft skills. And of course, what Julio just said, it's I would say fundamental to include in the curriculum. The way to do it, that's the challenge. But again, the university setting is probably the most appropriate to do that because we have all these different types of skills and areas that can be, if organized, it can and probably should be included also in the contents that are taught to our students. But I would consider this as this, let's say, this area of soft skills, that it's not only about biology or medicine or biochemistry. There's a whole lot of other things, which, by the way, the role of student associations here can be very relevant. And I'm sure this is all around. I know it's all around the way that student associations organize a lot of complementary activities that can actually fulfill some of these demands and some of these needs that can be actually played by students associations, which I think should have a big role also in some of the subjects that we've been talking about, and probably particularly about this one on the so-called soft skills.
Okay, Alexander?
If I may answer to that, yeah, we do, for example, also have soft skill training specifically, because that's exactly what we were thinking about. As I was saying, some schools have it, some don't. I think the way in which that would be even more successful is honestly if the faculty and the student association work together a little bit more closely, because it's completely understandable that the faculty doesn't have the capacity or the curriculum doesn't have the capacity. But if it were advertised, now, for example, I'm surprised that you know that we do that, because not a lot of people know that we do have these trainings. But it would be great if more people and more students knew that they could also come to us with the questions and stuff like that. So I think that would be a good idea to kind of collaborate a bit more closely.
I'm a watchful dean.
That is great. I wish everybody was.
Yeah.
Okay. We have one question. Oh, sorry, George. Go ahead.
Just mention something here. We've had one or two mentions of public health, and I mean, as somebody who's done basic science, clinical medicine, I'm now very heavily involved in public health in the UK and in Europe. It was a Cinderella discipline when I was a student. Really small numbers of people went into it. And now, and again, going back to the point about COVID, this has really highlighted the importance of public health, which of course goes into social medicine, and how we appreciate people around us, how we appreciate family life, how we get round people who are antagonistic to vaccination, let's say, you know, and how we can educate. So social medicine is absolutely crucial, but in fact, it feeds from scientific medicine. It feeds from the knowledge we've got. So as I age in medicine, I see medicine as just a continuum, you know, and we have built silos within it, which it's very sad, because actually it all joins together at the end. And I think we're getting back in all of our conversations to levels of core competence, which are crucial to have. And then you build on those in your specific areas, but you never lose your core competency. And this idea that medicine is a really broad spectrum. And as I said earlier on, doctors are all human beings. We all have families, we all get diseases, we all have challenges in our lives. And, you know, patients sometimes forget that, and we forget that as well.
But George, that brings a very important topic. It could give another webinar, which is the role of us, medical educators and medical doctors, medical community, scientific community, in educating the population. And what is the best, or what are the best strategies? We've seen now during this pandemic, lots of people from our community getting into the media, sometimes not the best ones, sometimes not the best recommendations, very much not well organized, so people just would come on a random basis. But that's a big thing. And I've mentioned that in my talk, which I consider also one of the big problems that we are facing. And somebody else already mentioned that about the fake news and about all this disinformation. And one because that's about, we are dealing with a situation which has major implications. So how should we, as medical scientific community, address this issue? How can we find the best ways to, because I think at the end is education. You know, education is on the base of everything. And my feeling is that this is about miseducation or lack of education of the population. We know there are other things involved, but I would say this is the main basic problem. So one of the challenges, and I know we don't have time to address that, is how should we, as medical and scientific community, develop a strategy that would mean how to best educate the population so we can avoid what's going on now around the world. We will always have that, we know that, but how can we minimize that? Because it's like a disease. Yep. You know, it will exist forever, but we should have I would say not only the need, but our obligation to minimize that problem. And that's a challenge also for us.
It's a huge challenge. And one of our famous politicians, I won't name him, said education, education, education. Crucial, absolutely crucial. And again, I have to give a personal example. My daughter teaches in a primary school in a very deprived area of London. And they have now got a curriculum for health education of the children. And it's aimed at 8-year-olds or even younger, talking about obesity, snack foods, and you know, all of the things that you mentioned, Fausto, which are amenable to change for the benefit of the individual and the benefit of the community at the same time. And so in one very simple answer to your question, I think we have to start young. And many children will not be exposed to this sort of help and education because of their family backgrounds. And I really strongly believe, having discussed this with my daughter, that to start in school is really important. And then there have to be ways of continuing. Now, if we look at smoking, the top parameter that you had in your lovely slide of alterations we could do. How long have we known that smoking is important in cardiovascular disease and in lung cancer? For years now, years. And yet we know tobacco is the most addictive substance known to man. 10 cigarettes, the Medical Research Council showed, is all a 10-year-old girl needs to become addicted to smoking. And it's still a huge problem, which we haven't really addressed properly. So,
the implementation at the young age is also something, for example, where student organizations are getting involved. For example, I know that ANEM, so the Portuguese Medical Student Association, is very much doing that they go into schools, and also in Germany we have these programs, and talk to young children and cook with them and talk about how, you know, the importance of a healthy diet and also physical exercise and all of these very important issues, which again is being organized by the students independently, and we are more than happy to do that. And I think that we could be useful in that sense also, because there is also that level of hierarchy in the population. When a doctor wants to say something, it's the doctor saying it, and there's some background in terms of pharma, all these stereotypes and issues that have also been arisen during the pandemic specifically. And with students, that's not the case, because we're not there yet. So we are maybe more part of the population, so to speak. But it's extremely important to start very young. And I think, and also leading with good examples. It's not good that you have medical students who go around saying, hey, you should stop smoking, but then they go and smoke because they're so stressed. So it's, I think it's both. It has to go hand in hand.
Catherine, a small comments. It's very interesting, and I can describe an original teaching program in France. The name is Service Sanitaire. the medical student and the health student, also the health students need to go in the school to discuss about global health, about prevention with young people. And I agree with George. We need to education, and to start very with young people, with the children. It's the issue to develop prevention in the future.
Okay, maybe to finish, because we're running low on time, but maybe I'll just go to each one of you and ask you to give like your final takeaway message that you hope people will take that home with them. Okay, so maybe I will go first to Julio. Do you have a take-home message?
I would like to say that everything is about communication and understanding. So we need to train future doctors that healing starts with communication and understanding. If we do that, and that's a never-ending process, will we be better off?
Okay, thank you. Jenny, your thoughts?
I think that medical school is a fantastic preparation, but for a hugely long career, and to keep an adaptability and openness to keep on learning and reinventing yourself is really important.
Mm-hmm. Professor Simoish, your final comments?
I feel the same. I mean, both Julio and Jenny, I mean, they made two very good points. It's education and understanding, competence, and be able to go on learning. I go on thinking that we should, because we did not discuss the shortage of doctors, and I think we should be very careful. I think that in the future we should go for the possibility of going together with other type of health professionals, but it's crucial to understand that it's probably better to reinforce the number of nurses and technicians and other types of professionals rather than going for increasing the number of medical doctors.
Okay, Professor Pinto?
I believe that the future of medical education should be based on not only the inclusion of the different topics that we discussed today, but also to be flexible, to be diverse, and to be able to maintain the essence of the medical profession. And that means maintain the values, what I've mentioned in terms of keeping ethical values as the standard. And this may sound like La Palice, but it's a reality that we are facing every day. So I would say the core values should be kept, at the same time that we should take advantage of the wonderful technological developments that should be included in the medical teaching, the medical education, but never forgetting our basic values as medical doctors.
Thank you. And Professor Mia de Machel? Sorry for my pronunciation.
It's not easy to say the name. Now, just do not forget, it was very interesting. So do not forget that we are all role models for the students.
Mm-hmm. Nice. And Professor Jean Sibilia?
According with Maria, the priority is to teach empathy and compassion, I think. And my second point is probably you have the responsibility to reinforce the collaboration in Europe and the Europe exchange for the students. I think Erasmus Plus is probably one of the best success of Europe, and you need to have the responsibility to together to create a new health Europe together.
Mm-hmm. And Alexandra, from your side?
I can only agree with what was said before, but to name some or to put something new on the table, I think reevaluation of the priorities in medical education is extremely important. And also, as we've seen now, because this was a very lively discussion, I enjoyed it a lot, and I think we learned a lot as well. I think it's very important to have all stakeholders present, including students, and also talk on an eye level as to see what the students and the professors both sides think as to how to improve the medical education. If, for example, if anyone's wondering about certain aspects specifically, we have done some studies, which again is from associations, on that students don't feel well equipped in terms of digitalization at all. And I think these eye-level discussions are extremely valuable to move forward.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Professor Constantinescu?
Yes, I think this was a wonderful meeting. I learned a lot. I think to finish, I would say that one word that we did not mention in this conversation was legitimacy. So in order to have the privilege to teach medical students, you have to be legitimately competent in the field, in teaching medicine. And I think that that is a very important aspect that we took for granted. But of course, this is, I think, in everyone's career in our field, the highest honor is to be able to influence the thinking process of future generation of students. And that is a huge responsibility.
And I'm just going to leave the floor to George then to close the session. Thank you.
Well, what a fantastic morning. I mean, I'm absolutely thrilled that people have been open, constructive, and I have learned a lot. In terms of your question, Catherine, my feeling would be to instill in medical students what a great privilege it is to be a doctor. You meet people for the first time, and within half an hour or an hour, you know immense detail of their lives and their challenges. And basically, what we are doing is using science to get into that situation and then to hopefully be able to manage, diagnose, manage, and treat. And the idea that medicine is actually a continuum. We live in silos, and we grow from a child to death. And this is a continuum, and medicine is a continuum as well. In terms of what we've heard today, I've been really, really impressed with everyone's comments. I think Fausto put it really beautifully, with technology being a drive for the future, but at the end saying that we have a changing face of medicine, but essentially we have to embrace the basics as well, the basics of being able to empathize, of compassion, and of being able to help patients. Stefan, who is a friend of mine, I have to say a very good friend, really summarized research and teaching, again, as being a continuum. And if we look on those as being different, this is a sad reflection on our education, to be quite frank. Without research, we wouldn't be able to advance. And I've used already the example of COVID being a prime example of the fusion of molecular sciences through to immunology, through to vaccines, through to community health. So it's this idea of medicine being a continuum that I would love to be able to instill. And the last thing I would say again is privilege. What a privilege it is to meet like-minded people and to meet people who have different ideas, but essentially we all come to the same conclusion. Core competence, compassion, keeping research going strongly so that we can use advances to the benefit of individuals and to the benefit of the community. So thank you, everyone. I mean, the contributions have been stellar, and I really, really have enjoyed the meeting greatly. Thank you. Good. Maria, you should finish. You're muted.
I'm mute.
You invited us to Lisbon.
So thank you very much. I was not introduced, but I'm also a vice president of FEAM. Thank you, George, for the opportunity to organize this conference. It was very, very interesting. Thank you, Alexandra, because you are the medical student, so you are the aim of all this discussion. And thank you, everybody. It was nice and interesting. So bye-bye.
Bye-bye. And thank you, Catherine. Thank you very much. Okay, bye.
Bye. Thank you for
Bye-bye.
having us. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Manuel, I'd love to talk to you sometime about the teaching of pathology. Because, you know, pathology to medicine is like mathematics is to physics.
Yeah.
You know, you could never do